One of the one of the themes that I think coalesced to me hearing what Margaret and company found in doing the research on citizen journalism sites is something that I think I've found in my personal experience also with citizen journalism sites, that the strength of any community site is not necessarily in its features. Often you'll find we news organizations, I come from our local paper, the Star Tribune, right across the Mississippi over there. And when we get into this business of saying, all right, we're going to begin our hyper-local citizen journalism initiative, when we launch out on that project, often we say, all right, we've got our team of developers and designers, we've got several software platforms to consider, we've got a few project managers, and we're going to bring over some folks from the sales side, and we're going to create something that is robust and allows people to submit photos and video and audio, and that folks can submit reports to from their cell phones. And we end up with a site with a lot of features and not necessarily a lot of participation. And part of the reason I think for that is very often, and this is another kind of undercurrent that I don't know if the research drove this out directly, but it's something that I'd be interested in seeing whether this actually does bear out. But very often these sites are driven by a strong community site, a strong citizen journalism site is driven by an individual or a small group of individuals who are very invested in a particular community and are willing to go after either filtering information for an audience, not necessarily an audience that they have or that they have some sort of reason to expect that they'll glean, but really for their own drive. They'll come home in the afternoon and they'll try to find whatever news and information they can ferret out related to a particular place or interest. And this is another thing that I am kind of interested in digging into more is we often talk about citizen journalism exclusively in a geographical context. When we think about citizen journalists, we think of folks in a neighborhood who are going out and reporting on that neighborhood or pulling together information on a particular place. And this is a place, a session about place, but many of the themes and the trends of the folks who are doing this work, I think you'll find their predecessors in these dispersed communities of interest that started coalescing on the internet years and years ago. Whether you're looking at a model for fan communities, for people or shows, cultural artifacts, or one of my good friends here in the Twin Cities is kind of this curious nexus, has been kind of this curious nexus between a niche interest citizen journalist and a geographical citizen journalist. He reports on GLBT issues within the Twin Cities and the upper Midwest more generally. And so you can kind of see by looking at examples like that, this nexus between an interest and geography, by looking at examples like that, you can sort of see the provenance of where some of the ideas and the practices that he's building off of come from. And many of those, I think, started in the interest-based work that folks have been doing for a long time on the internet. Another thing that started to coalesce as I listened to Margaret's description of the research is that the distinction as we draw it is often between citizen journalism and professional journalism. And I'm wondering if that's actually the right distinction to make. I'm wondering if what we're seeing more commonly on these sites isn't a distinction between a more individual-based journalism and more institutional-based journalism. That, as I mentioned before, I think many of these efforts you'll find are driven by, and the research bore this out, they're driven by these driven actors, folks who have an interest in really filtering out and ferreting out information on a particular community. often you'll find these communities coalesce around this individual or a small group of individuals, and it's their participation that really drives the endeavor. That other folks may be coming in and adding comments or adding other media, but it's a clearly identifiable group in many cases that will be driving this. And my last question, I guess, is a lot of our research so far has been focused on how do we motivate an audience? How do we create these citizen journalism efforts that will be popular with a group of consumers? And I think, and a question that's as important possibly is how do we motivate the creators? How do we find these individuals who are going to be in these communities and really make sure that every potential one of these folks is doing that work? But thank you again for a great presentation.
Those are great comments. I just would add one point, which is, as I said, this research was exceptionally messy, and among the categories we've tried to put together were sort of hybrid things because we didn't. I guess it's the Prius of a certain approach. But I mean, this is exactly the kind of commentary, and I love the question of how do we empower people who have things to say but perhaps don't feel like they have. The Lawrence Journal World has done an interesting job in training citizen journalists. They got sort of a citizen journalism U. And maybe there are other kinds of ways that collaborations among entrepreneurs, colleges and universities, and even legacy news sites can empower that kind of thing. I think that's a great idea. We can work on that next year, man.